this together. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham, and Abraham was the father of Isaac. Now everybody stay with me. This is 6 verses of genealogy. Now there's a bunch more, but we're going to save those for next week because I don't think I could keep you awake for the whole chapter, but here we go. Was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez, and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. I see some yawns. Okay, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram. There you go. A name of your next son, right there. Ram. I like that. And Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, or I don't know if he's a fish sound or not, if you got the L in there. And Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, and Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. Now, Matthew in this lineage goes back 14, 14, and 14. We're just doing 14 of the 42 this morning, okay? 14, 14. And if you think about it, 14, perfect number, 7 in the Jewish mindset. You could say it's 6 sevens, and Jesus is the first of the 7th 7. I have no idea if that's what Matthew had in mind. I just thought I'd throw that out. Okay, but there's 42. And so we've got this. And David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. And then is there one more verse? No, I think we're, okay. And Judah the father, no, okay, we'll get to that one in a minute. Okay, so we go through David. There's 14 generations and 14 names leading down through verse 6, getting to this one who had been Uriah's wife, who we know as Bathsheba. All right, has anybody researched their own genealogy? Yes, Larry, okay. I was speaking to you in the auditorium service this morning. I wonder why you weren't responding. You're in here. Okay, Larry's the librarian. He's the librarian, and of course he's done the genealogy. And now I can remember as a kid, my grandfather had it all in his head. I don't know if it seemed like this was more important in some generations back, and we would get together for family reunions, and he could tell you the cousins and the second cousins and the third cousins and the uncles and the great uncles and the fathers and the grandfathers and the great grandfather, and he had all of it in the cousins once removed. What are those? Never did really understand what a first and second cousin once removed was. Okay, but he had it all in his head, and I remember as a kid thinking, this is staggeringly boring. Okay, I was respectful of him, and I could tell it was very meaningful to him, but it didn't mean much to me as a kid. Now, as I've gotten older, and now as you get some of your life behind you, you start thinking about some of these things a little bit differently. And so I was out yesterday, and I want to share a little bit of this next week, but was looking at, I've got George Kryders that go all the way back to the Civil War. And Michael Kryder was the father of George Kryder. And then George Kryder served he was in the army for the North, and then was fighting in Kentucky and Tennessee during the Civil War. And he wrote over 100 letters back to his wife. And we've got all those preserved at the Bowling Green State University Library. And they've all been cataloged, and it's an historical documentation of kind of the process of what happened over 4 years of the Civil War. I'm going to read some of that, a little bit of one of the letters to you next week. I don't know if it'll mean anything to you, but I was crying. And I didn't have to read very much to just start bawling, and I'm like, I don't know him. What is it about this lineage and about this genealogy and about this history that was so emotional? I'll just leave that for you to think about a little bit as we move into this next week, and I want to share some of the rest of Matthew, particularly pertaining to that rest of Matthew 1. But if anyone could give a pop to telling the genealogy, actually it's Matthew. He has this angle because he's not interested in purely historical fact. That's not how he thought about the history. He wants to tell it from a point of view, what I would call this sort of mixture of history and theology, and so he attends to some details and then forgets other things, like he skips 3 chapters in the 1st or 2nd Kings. There's a bunch of kings in there. He just acts like they don't even exist in his retelling because they weren't germane to his story. And so see if you can follow this one. History is the tortilla that allows the burrito of theology to delight with freshness. That's an original, okay. In other words, the goodies inside the tortilla here are related to our understanding of God and His people. And how does He do it? He does it with this promise in 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 16, Alec. Let's put up that particular verse. It was right up there at the top now. And that is a promise that was made to David, that your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me, and your throne will be established forever. And so it's through this line of David that the Jewish people are expecting and anticipating their king to come. And so it's the reason that it's so important for him to open with the way he does with Matthew 1:1, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Okay? So the point is, God keeps His promises, and if He said there's going to be a kingdom that will come through David, then Matthew is going to tell how through the lineage of David, Jesus actually comes. And in spite of the fact that, if you remember, after David there was a divided kingdom, and then after the divided kingdom the people are in Babylon, and they're like, how could it possibly be a lineage that could lead all the way to Jesus hundreds and hundreds of years later? And Matthew wants to tell us how that happens. The son of David makes Matthew's genealogy move from just sort of this boring list of Jewish names to something that would have just been very alive, would have been dynamite to the Jewish people who were reading it, and they would have been asking themselves this question: is this Jesus related to David? And so they're looking for that divine lineage. But now what's interesting is the way he does it, is the way Matthew tells it. And I want you to see this, because there'll be some applications for us if we can get a hold of this. And that is, in Jesus' family tree, it is deeply troubled. Anybody got a deeply troubled family tree? I mean, some of us don't have to look very far. You know what I'm saying? Like, oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, I understand. I mean, there are some tough characters in this list. And I want one of the things about any genealogy that was fashioned in this day, it was always listed male. It was all about the men. And so, who is your father? Well, he's the father of so-and-so. Who is the father of so-and-so? Who is the father of so-and-so? Or the son of so-and-so? Or the son of so-and-so? It was all male. It was all male in terms of the lineage. And that's what makes this retelling of the story by Matthew so incredibly interesting, intriguing, risky. Because what Matthew does in the retelling is he mentions a bunch of women. And I want us to see that in our text here for just a moment or so. Notice verse 3. It says this: Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Perez, the father of Hezron, Hezron, the father of Ram. Matthew 1 and verse 3. Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was, where's the line? I'm missing a line. Oh. You all can see it. I can't read it. It's not on the screen back there. It's gone. Thank you. There it is. There's Tamar. She's still here. I was like, what happened to my slide? They changed the Bible on me. Okay. You're fine. It's all good. It's there. Okay. So here is Tamar. Now, Judah was the father of present Zerah through Tamar, but Tamar wasn't Judah's wife. That adds to an interesting intrigue to the story. In fact, she was Judah's daughter-in-law. Now that adds another dimension to Matthew's retelling of this. And if that's not strange enough, when the twins are conceived, Judah does not know who Tamar was or is. And in fact, he thought she was a prostitute that he had met on the road and didn't realize it was his own daughter-in-law. You're saying, is that in the Bible? And then what is that story in the Bible doing in this genealogy when Matthew didn't by any means need to put it in there because it's an all-male genealogy and he's telling about this woman, a woman thought to be a prostitute in the line of Jesus. Okay, that's woman number one. How about verse 5? Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Remember Rahab? Rahab the harlot or prostitute? Yep. That's how we know her. And while labeling, I don't suggest is a good practice, she does have a reputation. And here she is in the city of Jericho. I want to point out she was a non-Jew. She has great faith in God, and her life is spared, but her occupation, it may have been a source of survival for us. So let's not be too harsh for her, source of survival for her. Not the most honorable background, but again, what kind of lineage is this? Another woman, a prostitute for sure, and a non-Jew. Now, the Jews were taught to not intermarry. No king should take a foreign wife. And yet here she is in this lineage, a prostitute non-Jew in the family tree. What is Matthew's angle? All right, let's look at verse 5. He says this, then Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was, thank you, Brian's holding it up so I can read it. He's got it there on the sign. Ruth. Okay, very good. Ruth, a good, sweet woman, albeit a bit aggressive at times. But she asked, and what I'm saying by that is she asked to either marry or sleep with Boaz, depending on how you interpret the text. And maybe she was inviting both, because to sleep with Boaz would be to be married to Boaz. But the reader's surprise, really, in the story of Ruth, was not her sleeping with Boaz so much as it was that she was a Moabite, another non-Jew. The Moabites were a crass people. They were not worshipers of God. They were shunned by the Jews. There were fighting and feuding between them for centuries. They came from Lot's side. And, there was this incestuous, Lot's son Moab, who was described as being born from an incestuous relationship between Lot and his eldest daughter. Deuteronomy 30, there's a lot in the Bible, isn't there? Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 3, there's a verse that basically says, don't do this intermarry thing. And yet here she's showing up. What do you think of Matthew's story so far with these three women? All right, there's one more further down the list. There's a great hero of faith in here that ends with King David. We're trying to get to David. And so David is, what do we know about him? He's this mighty warrior. He's a poet. He's passionate. He's a leader of the people. He's a lover of God. He seems to have the blessing of God on him. And what does Matthew point out about the great King David? Let's read it again. And Jesse, the father of King David, David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. She isn't even mentioned by name. We're talking about Bathsheba. What is pointed out about King David in this lineage is his most severe character flaw, his biggest moral lapse in his entire career. So of all his great qualities, Matthew highlights the fact that David is an adulterer and a murderer, and the text refuses to say the mother's name. What a slippery way to describe both Bathsheba and to define David. At least tell the readers, Matthew, that David married her. But no, he doesn't even do that. All right, let's summarize. 4 women in a genealogy that is traditionally an all-male line. These women appear center stage in a society where women are marginalized. And the women in this line represent, if not full equality denied them within much of Judaism, at least acknowledgement and inclusion. And in fact, Jesus offers dignity to women in such a way that we are experiencing the fruit of his views to this day. Do you think that what is going on right now in the media as it relates to women and sexual misconduct and sexual harassment would be even discussed if it were not for the influence of Jesus of Nazareth? On close examination, none of the 4 women mentioned are Jewish. Tamar is a Canaanite, Rahab is from Jericho, Bathsheba is a Hittite, and of course, Ruth is a Moabite. Do you think God is trying to tell us something about the importance of the non-Jew, the foreigner, to break down a nationalistic way of thinking and saying that has got to go in the kingdom of God? This text is absolutely loaded, as it becomes a mini gospel and a precursor to helping us think about the ministry in the kingdom of Jesus as he ministers to non-Jews and to women, giving them a status that had never been known in the history of the world. I believe that Matthew's point, as he goes hunting all over the Bible to find the most questionable liaisons and then enjoys inserting them into the story, is to say that sexual perversion and murder and pride and idolatry and faithlessness, while it may happen on the human level, will not distort God's story and God's redemption of the world. That our story is one of constant screw-ups, and God has a plan, and he will stick to it, and he will work it out in his time, in his way. And so Matthew preaches this great gospel of inclusion that is good news even in this boring genealogy. A gospel that transcends sex and race and nationality and morality. And so we learn then, and I want us to see this, that sometimes we allow Jesus to float 3 or 6 or 9 feet above the earth. And while he was perfect, even in his humanity, think of his family tree and root him appropriately as a human being in his story. He wasn't born into a perfect family. His background was incredibly messy and flawed, and yet God did his work, Emmanuel, God with us, through him. Let me put it this way. King Jesus came not only for sinners, but from sinners. He's the Savior for the absolute worst of the sinners, and for us when we are at our worst. The other thing, as I was reading that and thinking about this week, is it will be no surprise if the church the Church of God, the Church of Christ, the McKnight Crossings Church, absolutely reflects the mess that we see in this lineage. Why would we expect it to be any different? And while we clean ourselves up pretty well sometimes, and we kind of bring our best side, my hunch is that every sordid story and mess up that we see and moral and failure that is being outlined here is here. Matthew enjoyed, I believe, this task because he was thrilled to demonstrate how wide and deep is God's mercy. So the challenge, I believe, for us is to give up the old narrative. The stories that we tell ourselves that don't fit. Rather, let's fit ourselves into God's story of mercy and redemption regardless of what all of our flawed backgrounds. Some of that story, that self-narrative, might be like this. It's up to me. It's up to me. This story proves, this genealogy proves over and over and over and over, it's not up to me. I've got to get it right. Who in this lineage got it right? And yet God did his work. I have to do it on my own. No, you don't. God's got this through his deep and wide mercy. I've got to be so good I can go to heaven. That one's always been a lie. That is just an absolute lie. Stop it, stop it, stop it. You're not going to get to heaven by your own goodness. Only by his mercy and only by his grace do we become into a relationship with the living Christ. And I'm not good enough. Yeah, that one's true, but stop telling yourself that all the time, okay? That gets to be a rather tired old rant as well. Live in the mercy and wideness of God's loving kindness toward you and his church. Do you remember the song, Deep and Wide? Deep and wide, there's a fountain flowing. Deep and wide. Some of you need to take hold of God's character. Maybe even through that song this week. It's so rich in that it's one of those songs for those of us who know it. Some of the younger ones may not, but that gets deep. Deep and wide with mercy. And live out of his mercy. He's using messed up people in the most difficult circumstances to redeem and renew the world, even you. God is in charge of history, his kingdom, his church, this church. I put it this way as a summary. God works his plan of redemption through his Son, even as he works it out through women, foreigners, and sexual scandal, or you could say moral failure. That's the story of Matthew 1. That's the story of the Bible. That's the story of Advent. That's the story of Christmas. Jesus, Son of David, from a line of broken souls for a world of broken souls, for you and for me. Will you participate? Come on up, praise team. Will you participate in this lineage, in this story, through the line of David?